This morning, we are going to be in the book of James again. If you have your Bibles, please turn to the book of James with us. James chapter 2, primarily dealing with verse 14, but we'll also have some others. James chapter 2, verse 14. It'll also be on the screen behind us. And it reads, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such a faith save them?" Ken Davis wrote a book entitled How to Speak to Youth. And in the book, he shares his story about being in public speaking class. They were told that during one speech, they were going to be graded on how creative they could drive a point home in a memorable way to the rest of the class. And so one student came prepared just to do that. And he was going to give a speech on the law of the pendulum. And so I have a pendulum up here, a picture of it. He spent 20 minutes carefully explaining all the physical principles that govern a swinging pendulum. A pendulum can never return to the point fully that it was when it started. And so if you have a pendulum and you pull it up here and you let it go, because of friction and because of gravity, it will never return fully to that point. It certainly will never go beyond that point. And so after 20 minutes of explaining all the laws and physics that go behind it, he took a thumbtack and he put it above the chalkboard and he tied a top to the end of it. And so just to illustrate it, he pulled that top up on the blackboard and he let it go. And each time it would swing back, he would mark it on the chalkboard so that people could physically see it started here, then it was here, then it was here, and then it came to rest. But he wasn't done. You see, before class, he had hung a giant pendulum in the middle of the class from a steel beam that was attached to the ceiling. And he took 500-pound test, paracord, and he strung up 250 pounds of steel weights, just as an illustration. So while he's talking about the pendulum, everybody's looking at this big pendulum in the middle of the room. And he says, "I have one final illustration for everybody." He asked the teacher to come forward, and the teacher does. And he climbs up on this table and he asks the teacher to sit down in a chair with his head facing the wall. And he pulled that pendulum right up to the face of his teacher. And as he held it there, 250 pounds of steel weights, he began to explain the law of the pendulum again. And he said, "I've shown you the law of physics that this pendulum can never fully reach the point at which it started again. But now it's in front of the teacher's face." And he says, "Now, do you believe in the law of the pendulum?" And the teacher, who was applauding him just a little bit ago, he says he began to see sweat beads form on his forehead, right? And he wasn't so boisterous this time when he swallowed, and he said in a soft whisper, "Yes." So he let the pendulum go. And he said there was a swoosh as it went to the far east side of the room, and then it started to swing back. And he says, right as it started to swing back, he had never seen his teacher move so fast in his life. That he began jumping off the table and ducking under other tables. There was no way he was going to sit in that chair. And so he just asked the class one more time, "Do you think he believed in the law of the pendulum?" And there was a unanimous decision that he did not believe, right? We are covering some of the important topics found in the book of James this month. Last week we began the journey by recognizing how James is a short and a practical book. It's really easy to read because James is not primarily concerned with explaining the deep mysteries of God. He's not concerned with piecing together theology for us to understand it better. His primary concern is that once we step into the life of faith, once we step into salvation, that faith has to go from our head to our heart and out into our hands where we can live it in a lifestyle of faith. And so it's a practical book. And what he's saying is if you believe things, if you have faith, then your faith is worth living in the world. Your faith should govern your actions, govern your thoughts, govern your decisions. But sometimes we know that we're like that teacher, right? That when time comes for us to live out what we believe, we can know all the principles behind it. We can know the reality and we can know the truth. But sometimes When the temptations and the trials and the hardships of life come our way, we are like that teacher ducking and running underneath the tables, right? It's not always easy to live out the faith that we profess. James recognizes something in the life of the believer. He recognizes just how easy it is for us to say and to even believe in certain things. And yet making that crossover to living it out in our lifestyle seems to be hard sometimes. Today, James is bringing into consideration another area of life where we must be willing to hold our ground. We must be willing to let our beliefs dictate the way that we live, dictate our actions and how the world sees our actions. Today, we're going to see what James has to say about the relationship between our faith and our deeds. Faith and deeds. And so, James chapter 2. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such a faith save them? It really is a bold question, a bold statement, but we don't fully understand it until we have the background of the text. And so we're going to get excited about a little history lesson. Can we say, I'm excited about history? There's some history buffs out there that's loving that right now. Everyone else is like, I don't know about that. Old Testament Judaism, the Jews, and how they lived out their faith. Their religion was based upon law. Yeah. And that means they had this set of rules, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And it explained exactly how they're going to live to a T. What they're not to eat, what they're not to do, what they are to do, cleansing rituals, what it means to follow God. And that was how they earned their righteousness. And I know I've said this before. Righteousness, a right relationship with God, according to the Jews, meant that they followed the law as best that they could. And so Jesus came with the good news, and it really was good news, that our relationship with God was not based on how well we can follow a set of rules, right? Our relationship with God was now going to be based on what Jesus was going to do on our behalf. Yeah. It was no longer about trying to live up to the law and failing miserably, because the Jews failed miserably over and over again. And it seemed to be after a while that the real lesson was there's nothing we can do to be good enough. There's nothing that we can do. There's no amount of good works that I can do that can save me. And so the good news, the gospel, really was good news. Because Jesus Christ died on the cross so that anyone who believes in Him shall be saved. And it's a faith thing. It's no longer a works thing. But in order for us to step out of the worldly stuff, into grace and into salvation and have this relationship with God, it's no longer about earning our way up the steps, but it's about just receiving that sacrifice and putting our faith and our hope in Jesus Christ. Yeah. Well, the Jews had a hard time understanding this, right? The message wasn't easily taken by the Jews. It still isn't even today. It had been ingrained in them that walking with God was following the law and doing good works. Doing good deeds. That's what it meant to follow God. And Paul, he was a champion of the gospel. He was a champion of grace through faith doctrine. Because he was charged with preaching to the Gentiles. These people that weren't the Jews, they were outsiders. They didn't know what it meant to be clean. They didn't know what the food laws were. They didn't have any idea how to do sacrifices. And really, in the mind of the Jews, they were inferior. Because there's no way that they could please God. There's no way they could ever be good enough or clean enough or do the right things to please and be in a relationship with God. Paul comes along and he says, I'll tell you what, Gentiles. Everyone may think that you're outsiders, may think that you're unworthy, but I want you to know that you don't have to earn your way to salvation. That Jesus died so that you will just believe in Him, put your trust in Him. And then the Gentiles also were welcomed into the family of God. Welcomed into that prestigious place of a holy people set apart for God's purpose. We are the Gentiles, by the way, right? We're those unwanted, undeserving people. And we need to hear that message that Paul says. We need to hear the good news that there's nothing we can do to earn our way into the good graces of God. God offers His hand to us, and He provided the sacrifice for us. So it's truly good news. Good news for the Gentiles, good news for us. You mean that we can have a relationship with God without being circumcised and become a Jew? I think that's good news. Right? You mean that we can have a relationship with God and we can still eat pork? Amen. I like bacon, right? I'm all about that kind of good news. You mean that I don't have to worry about, exactly keeping all of the little itty-bitty laws that everybody pounded on top of the Jews, and they couldn't do anything right, and they kept breaking the law, but I can still be accepted by grace? Yeah. That is good news, right? It is good news. So a fundamental part of our faith is that we enter into the realm of grace by trusting and putting our faith in Jesus Christ. That's it. I had explained last week that in the mind of James, he has this holiness setting, right? He has this view of the world that it's the world and worldly things, and then it's godly things. And it's the realm of grace and salvation. And when we step out of the worldly things, we step into a godly way of life. And it governs everything that we do. It governs our thoughts and our decisions. And today, he's saying it also governs our actions. It governs our good deeds. And so imagine how foreign this sounded to the Jews who had been trying to earn their righteousness by following the law and doing good works. And it was like Paul was taking all their traditions, all their laws, and throwing it out the window and saying, you've done it wrong all this time. It's not exactly what he was doing, but you can see how they took it that way. But it really is just the flip side of the same coin. And that's what I want to get to. Anyone here from a big family? Anyone raised in a big family?
I have 5 in the house.
I got one person, 2 people. Okay, so this illustration is for you two. Everyone else just kind of tune out and don't nap too long. But I grew up in a big family. And I grew up thinking that it was common experience just to know and to recognize who the favorites were in the family. Like I had a lot of brothers and sisters, 7. And we all agreed that we knew who Mom and Dad loved more. Right? I mean, they were the favored ones. The ones not to be named. Right? It seemed like Mom and Dad were so full of grace with them. And so easy on discipline. And then when I would mess up, or one of us unfavored ones would mess up, it'd be like hard on discipline. And the grace is gone. There's no grace. Well, sometimes those favored ones, not to be named, would get into some trouble that they couldn't get out of. And they would actually finally get some consequences. And to us other ones, the unfavored ones, this was like Christmas time. I mean, we really liked this when this happened. And I remember my siblings being in trouble and having to sit in timeout or stand in the corner. And all the rest of us, what are we doing? We're like, we're being as childish as I'm making faces at them. I'm tapping my butt. I'm really trying to get somebody to blow their top here and get into deeper trouble, right? It feels like the Jews were looking at the Gentiles, and the Gentiles were kind of flying in the face of the Jews who had done all these things to try and be upright with God. They were trying to be right with God by following the rules. And yet here comes these Gentiles, and now they're the favored ones. They're the ones that get all the grace. They're the ones that get to walk right into this relationship with God. I'm the one that hasn't ever had bacon in my life. I mean, there's hurt and there's resentment going on there. It's no wonder why I wasn't one of the favored ones. Right? Well, when you read through the New Testament and you study up on the background of these doctrines, people have pinned these two doctrines up against each other throughout the course of history, okay? People have pinned good works against grace and said the two cannot coexist, because here's what people did. The ones who heard that message of grace, heard that message of faith only, and that's all you need, took it to an unhealthy place. They took it to an unhealthy extreme. You know what? If my standing with God doesn't depend on my behavior, then once I step into salvation, I also don't have to worry about my behavior. I can just go on living life the way I was. And Paul had some trouble with this. Paul wrestled with it in some of his churches. Because he's telling people, just step into grace, step into faith. And then when they start taking it the unhealthy way, he began seeing people profess faith in God, profess saving faith, and yet they were still loyal to their idols. They were still loyal to the false gods. They were still living immoral lives. They were still doing things that did not please God and did not honor God. And so one of the passages in Romans says, what shall we say then? Should I go on sinning? Because some people have this mentality, so that grace may multiply? And the answer is no. Don't do it. The flip side of the coin, and this is where James comes in to join Paul in that. James, with his Jewish background, his Christian leader in Jerusalem, where all the Jews were, he brings in great wisdom to the theological conversation. And it's not against grace, but it adds to our understanding of grace. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith, but they have no deeds? Can such a faith save them? And he's a bold voice that reminds us as Christians that our deeds, our good works and behavior have to be taken into account when it comes to a journey with Christ. Right? That when we step into the grace of God, when we step into this relationship with the good Father, this is not the ending step. We've not crossed the finish line. We've only began the race.
That's right.
Right?
Yep.
And so it's not about earning your way by good works. That's not what James is saying. James is saying, now that you're here, to deepen your faith, develop your faith, that your good works may abound.
Yep.
That your good works will be a sign to the world that Jesus Christ has changed something here.
There you go.
Right? Because stepping into grace is more than just a title. It's more than a name badge that we wear and saying, I'm saved, I'm saved. We should live lives to where we never have to have a salvation badge. People see our good works. People see our lifestyle.
Yeah.
And they say, there's something saved about them. There's something faith about them. There's something that glorifies God in their life. So when people properly understand both of the doctrines, they understand that faith and works are not pinned against each other. We are to be people saved by faith, doing good works.
That's right.
In the grace of God, empowered by God to be His light in a dark world. And so we cannot be either side of the extreme. You can't earn your way to God, so don't try. We'll never be good enough to earn God's love. He loves us anyway.
That's right.
Right? And once we're here, we can't say, well, I'll go on and live my life how I want, because it's no longer our life.
That's right.
It's God's life in and through us in the world. And He will use us in mighty and miraculous ways.
Yep.
One of my favorite quotes used to be, before somebody tore it all apart, was Francis of Assisi. And he said, always preach the gospel. And when necessary, use words. All right? Always preach the gospel. But when it's necessary, use your words. And so he was trying to tell people, it's more than what you say that glorifies God. It is our lifestyle and it is our actions that glorify God. And so deeds. What are our deeds? A deed is an action that is performed intentionally or consciously. And good deeds are things that we consciously and intentionally do to honor God by helping others. A young boy on an errand run for his mother had just bought a dozen eggs. He's walking out of the store and he tripped and he drops the sack and all the eggs broke, making the sidewalk a mess. Now the people that were gathered there come up to him and tell him how sorry, they help him up and how they didn't like to see that happen. But amongst all that pity, one man hands him a quarter. And then turns around and says to the other ones, I care about 25 cents worth. How much do you care? And what he was saying to the people is, if you really have sympathy, let's help this gentleman out through actions and through deeds. Bring it home. There are more parallels in the book of James than any other book outside of the Gospels to the Sermon on the Mount. And it is clear when you read it that he is relying heavily on the teaching of Jesus, his brother, and the Sermon on the Mount. The parallels can be lined up. One of my all-time favorite scriptures is when Jesus taught his disciples that they were to be salt and light. I just love it because it's about our influence in the world. He says you're going to be salt of the earth. And it don't mean much to us today, but they used to pack meat with salt to keep it from rotting and decaying. And he's saying, now, when you're my disciples, you are going to be the people who will stop the world from rotting and decaying. You will have that kind of influence on the world. And he says that you're also going to be my light. I mean, we know how light works, right? When light is turned on, darkness is expelled. It's exposed, and it's unwanted. And he says, as my disciples, you will be the light of the world, exposing and expelling darkness out of the way. And here's what he says, this little section right after that, to tie it in. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify the Father in heaven.
Yep.
Right? It's not all about street preaching. Right? It's not all about going and sharing this with our mouth. It's about doing good deeds. And Jesus says, when they see your good deeds, they will glorify God. Our good deeds glorify our Father in heaven. We are the testimony. Our lives are the testimony of God's power and His might, His ability to use us. And it doesn't matter where we've come from. It doesn't matter what our background is, how rich we are or poor we are, how old or how young. God and Jesus Christ want to use our lives to testify to the world about His saving grace and His power.
Amen.
Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. We are not meant to receive that salvation and sit on it.
Yeah.
We are meant to be that light in the world, shining a light for others so that they can see through the darkness. So what does faith look like without action? He goes on to explain. Here's what faith looks like if action is not attached to it. Suppose a brother or sister, which means somebody in the fellowship, a brother or sister, somebody in here, was without clothes or daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace and keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs. And he asks that question again, what good is it? Anyone got an answer for that? What good is that?
No good.
No good, right? I think that's what James would say too. You know what? That's no good. Don't tell somebody, go in peace, when they have needs that you can fulfill. Get up and fulfill the needs in the name of Jesus Christ and let your light shine to them and to others who will see. But then, on an ending note, he also includes what faith does look like when faith and action are working together. And so he talks about Abraham. Was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together. And his faith was made complete by what he did. His example of faith and action goes back to Abraham. And it's a long story, so I'll give the history lesson as short as possible. But God promised Abraham, I'm going to give you a son. And Abraham was old, and he didn't know if he could believe it or not, but eventually he believed it. And he had this son, even though he was real old, he knew he was not going to have any more. But God said, I'll use that son to make your descendants full. I'll make you a great nation. And the next thing you know, God's saying, take your son and sacrifice him on the altar. Imagine the anguish in his heart. What? And he has to make that decision. Will I trust God and obey and do what he just asked me to do, even though this is my only son? Even though he promised he's going to use this son? Or will I not be obedient and risk losing the promise that God made to me? And it says that he walked to the altar with his son. His son's even asking questions. You know, Dad, where's the sacrifice at? You're like, where's the ram? And he's probably getting nervous, you know. And all Abraham could say is, God will provide that sacrifice. Mm-hmm. And he finally gets there. And he shows that willingness. He has that willingness to sacrifice, to be obedient to God. And God provides the ram for the sacrifice. And now, without context, it seems like a crude story, right? Like, why would his faith be tested in such a way? But this story was passed down through generations and generations. Mother told it to daughter, and father told it to son, and they never even fully knew the significance of the story. You see, because that was a foreshadow of what God was going to do with Jesus Christ. The sacrifice that Abraham never had to make was the sacrifice that God was willing to make for you and for me. And so faith and action working together is a story of sacrifice. And the greatest example of sacrifice we've ever seen is God's Son on the cross dying for us. That is faith and actions working together. A sacrifice made for us. His love ran red so that we can be washed white. This morning, as James speaks to us, I hope and I pray that we get that message that our faith has to be more than what we proclaim with our mouth and what we believe in our heart. Our faith has to be our testimony lived out in our lifestyle. And so whatever you're doing and wherever you're at, it's never too late to say, God, help me to be that light in a dark world. It doesn't matter what you're struggling with. It doesn't matter what's going on in your life or your background. God wants to use all of us, every single one of us, to put our faith into actions, to be salt and light, to be a testimony in a dark world. I pray that this morning we'll respond to that word. However God lays it on your heart. Maybe